My son pushed me at the Christmas table until 47 calls from the bank made him homeless. Greenwich House was resplendent at the Christmas party, the air thick with pine and pride. In the midst of it all, Robert, in his old tweed jacket, felt like a lost note. His son, Mark, greeted him with a half-hearted hug. "Mark, darling," his mother-in-law interrupted, her voice scornful. "That tweed jacket is staining you." Mark stepped back, hastily wiping his suit jacket. "Mum, stop it," he said, then turned to Robert. "Dad, perhaps you should get a glass of water? You look lost." William, Mark's father-in-law, finished the humiliation. The academic world must be quiet. Here, we make the noise. The rejection was absolute. Robert stood alone, a ghost at the party, humiliated and erased by his own son. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you? And where are you listening? The sheer, unadulterated perfection of it all was beginning to feel like a personal affront. Greenwich House, as Eleanor Hamilton liked to call her sprawling Connecticut mansion, wasn't just decorated for Christmas. It was curated. Towering fir trees, flown in from some ridiculously remote forest in Oregon, stood sentinel in the grand foyer, their branches heavy with hand-blown glass ornaments that probably cost more than Robert's first car. The air, thick with the scent of fresh pine and polished mahogany, was periodically pierced by the high, tinkling laughter of women in silk and the deeper, self-satisfied rumbles of men in cashmere. It was a symphony of wealth, and Robert, in his slightly too warm tweed jacket, felt like a discordant note. He had come because Mark had asked him to, begged him, really. "Dad, this is important to me," he'd said over the phone, his voice tight with the tension that had become its default setting. "I need you there." And so Robert had driven the 2 hours from his quiet, book-lined home, telling himself that a father's duty was to show up. He hadn't realized that showing up would feel so much like disappearing. Mark spotted him from across the room, a flute of champagne held delicately between his fingers. He navigated the sea of guests with the practiced ease of someone who now belonged in these waters. "Dad, you made it." He leaned in for a hug, a gesture so brief and passionless it was more a brushing of shoulders than an embrace. As he pulled back, Robert watched, with a slow, sinking feeling, as Mark discreetly plucked a tissue from his pocket and wiped an invisible speck of lint from the precise spot on his velvet vest where Robert's tweed jacket had made contact. It was a small act, microscopic, in the grand scheme of the party, but it felt like a surgical incision, swift and deep. It was a denial, an erasure of the stain of a humble, academic origin that didn't quite match the sheen of the Hamilton-approved velvet. "Dad, you know Catherine, of course." His daughter-in-law drifted toward them, a vision in emerald green silk. She smiled, a perfect, practiced arrangement of teeth and lips. "Robert, so glad you could come," she said, her voice as smooth as the wine she offered him. "Can I get you a glass of this lovely Bordeaux?" Before Robert could accept, a third voice, crisp and commanding, cut through the air. "Catherine, darling," said Eleanor Hamilton, materializing at her daughter's side like a designer-clad apparition. "Perhaps a glass of mineral water would be better for your father-in-law." Her eyes flickered over Robert's tweed jacket, a silent, damning appraisal. The implication hung in the air, as heavy as the crystal chandelier overhead. Wine was for their kind of people, water was for others. The patriarch of this gilded cage, William Hamilton, finally turned his attention to Robert. He was a man carved from granite and ambition, his handshake firm but fleeting. "Robert," he said, his eyes already scanning the room over Robert's shoulder, searching for a more valuable connection, a more profitable conversation. "The academic world must be very quiet. Here, we're used to making things move." He clapped a hand on Mark's back, a gesture of ownership rather than affection. The dismissal was absolute. Robert was left standing alone, a ghost at the feast, clutching a glass of San Pellegrino as if it were a lifeline. He watched his son, his brilliant, once idealistic Mark, trailing in William's wake like a pilot fish chasing a shark. Mark's posture was different here. He was hunched ever so slightly, a supplicant in his own home. He laughed a little too loudly at William's jokes, nodded a little too eagerly at his pronouncements. Robert drifted toward the edge of the room, positioning himself behind a ridiculously large poinsettia plant. From his vantage point, he could see them huddled near the fireplace. William, Mark, and another man in a suit so sharp it could have drawn blood. They spoke in low, urgent tones. Words floated across the perfumed air, detached from their context but charged with meaning. Risky investment, he heard William say, his voice skeptical, and then Mark's desperate and pleading. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, William. I just need some capital to get in on the ground floor. A wave of dizziness washed over Robert, a nausea born not of the rich food he hadn't eaten, but of a profound and sickening sense of loss. His mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, retreated. It fled the oppressive perfection of Greenwich House and landed in the cozy, cluttered living room of their old two-bedroom apartment 25 years ago. It was Christmas morning. A young Mark, maybe 7 years old, was tearing the wrapping paper off a simple plastic model airplane, his face alight with a joy so pure it was almost painful to remember. It was a $10 gift, but in that moment, it was the whole world. He remembered Mark's unadulterated glee, the way he'd thrown his arms around Robert's neck, his small hands sticky with candy cane. There was no velvet vest to protect, no invisible stains to wipe away. The memory was a betrayal, a cruel juxtaposition to the man standing by the fire, practically begging his father-in-law for money. Robert looked at his son, at the strained smile plastered on his face as William Hamilton shook his head dismissively, and he felt not anger, but a deep, hollow sorrow. The boy who had found boundless joy in a simple plastic toy had become a man who believed his worth was tied to a risky investment. The pressure of this world, the relentless pursuit of more, had warped him, sanded down his edges, until he fit neatly into this perfect, polished box. The clinking of champagne glasses and the bursts of manufactured laughter faded into a dull roar. Robert felt a profound loneliness settle over him. The cold, heavy kind that comes from seeing someone you love become a stranger. He was an outsider in his own family, a relic from a life his son was desperately trying to outrun. And as he watched Mark's shoulders slump in defeat under William's icy gaze, a chilling question began to form in his mind. What, exactly, was this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? And just how far was his son willing to go to seize it? Just as Robert was contemplating the tactical advantage of hiding behind a marble bust of some forgotten Roman emperor for the rest of the evening, a hand clamped down on his arm. It was Mark, his face pale and slick with a fine sheen of sweat. Dad, come with me. Now. There was no room for argument in his voice. He steered Robert out of the grand hall, down a corridor lined with somber portraits of Hamilton ancestors, and into a room that was clearly William's inner sanctum. The door clicked shut, silencing the party chatter and plunging them into a heavy, oppressive quiet. The room smelled of old leather, expensive cigars, and something else unvarnished power. Books, bound in dark leather, stood untouched on mahogany shelves, more props than literature. This was a room where deals were made and fortunes were broken. What is it, Mark? What's going on? Mark's carefully constructed composure had shattered. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his hands running through his hair. I'm screwed, Dad, royally screwed. He spoke in a panicked whisper, as if the portraits on the walls were listening. The investment, that venture capital thing I mentioned, is not what I thought. It's on the verge of collapsing, and I'm over-leveraged. I put everything in. Robert felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a feeling far more chilling than the mansion's impeccable climate control. Everything? Everything, Mark confirmed, his voice cracking. If William finds out, he'll ruin me. He'll see me as a failure, a bad investment. Catherine, he trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. She'll leave me, I'll lose it all. He was playing every card, Robert knew. He was playing on a father's primal fear of seeing his child's life implode. Pity and worry churned in Robert's stomach. This was his son, his brilliant boy, reduced to a trembling mess in a rich man's study. Mark stopped his pacing and moved to the massive mahogany desk. He fumbled with his briefcase, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the latch. He pulled out a thick sheaf of papers and a pen, a sleek, black Mont Blanc that looked ridiculously out of place in his trembling grip. "I don't need your money, Dad," he said, his voice dropping, becoming conspiratorial, pleading. He flipped through the document, a blur of fine print and legal jargon, stopping at the final page. He pushed it across the polished surface of the desk. "I just need your signature, right here." Robert stared at the empty line next to the X. "My signature? For what? I don't understand." He squinted. The text was a dense, impenetrable block. He left his reading glasses in the car, a small, foolish oversight that now felt like a catastrophic error. He didn't want to admit it. Not here. Not now. It felt like another weakness. "It's nothing, really," Mark said, talking too fast. "It's just a guarantee, a bona fide for the bank. It's to show them I have assets backing me up, to buy me a few weeks to sort this out. It's just a formality, Dad. A piece of paper. You have to sign it. I only have a few days left. A piece of paper." The phrase felt wrong. Robert, a man who had dedicated his life to the power of the written word, knew that no piece of paper was ever just a piece of paper. His instincts, honed by decades of academic rigor, screamed at him, "No, read it, ask questions." But his son's desperate face was a far more powerful argument than reason. "Mark, what is this document actually collateralizing?" Mark flinched, but quickly recovered. It's the house." The air left Robert's lungs. The house. Not just four walls and a roof, but the vessel that held the entire story of his life, of his marriage. Suddenly, the scent of leather and cigars was gone, replaced by the faint, phantom smell of the rose bushes Sarah had planted by the porch. He was transported to another room, a sterile hospital room, 10 years ago. Sarah's hand, frail but still warm, was in his. "Promise me, Robert," she had whispered, her voice a reedy thread. "Promise me you'll never sell the house. It's our place. It's where we lived. Keep it. For you. For Mark." He had promised. It was a sacred vow, the last one he had made to her. And now Mark was standing here with a fancy pen and a cheap lie, asking him to break it. "Mom would want you to help me," Mark whispered, his voice thick with a counterfeit emotion that was both brilliant and monstrous. "She always believed in me." That was the final blow. Using her memory as a weapon. It was cruel, and it was devastatingly effective. Robert looked at the signature line. He looked at his son's ravaged face. The academic in him screamed, but the father, weak and foolish and broken, won out. The conflict was over. He had already lost. With a hand that felt disconnected from his body, he took the Mont Blanc pen. Its weight was obscene. He leaned over the desk, his heart pounding a funeral drum against his ribs, and signed his name. The ink flowed, black and final. A violation, an act of self-betrayal born of a love that had just been weaponized against him. Mark snatched the document back before the ink was even dry, his relief so palpable it was nauseating. "Thank you, Dad. You'll see. It's just for a few weeks. I'll fix this." He didn't meet Robert's eyes. He stuffed the paper into his briefcase, turned, and walked out of the study, slamming the door behind him. Robert was left alone in the suffocating silence, the ghost of his signature hanging in the air. He wasn't angry at Mark, not yet. The anger would come later. For now, there was only a vast, echoing guilt. He had broken his promise. He had gambled his past for his son's precarious future, and he had a terrible, sinking feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. January bled into February, and the silence from Mark grew from a quiet concern into a roaring, deafening void. Robert found himself living in a state of suspended animation, a self-imposed purgatory of waiting. He told himself that no news was good news. He told himself that Mark was a busy man, that the world of high finance didn't pause for fatherly checking calls. He told himself these lies in the morning while staring into the bathroom mirror, and again at night when the quiet of the house became too much to bear. His days fell into a meaningless rhythm. He would sit in his favorite armchair with a dense history of the Peloponnesian War, read the same page 4 times, and realized he hadn't absorbed a single word. The ancient Greeks and their squabbles felt absurdly distant. His own domestic Cold War was the only conflict that mattered. He worked in the garden, mechanically pruning the rose bushes that Sarah had planted, his movements devoid of the joy he used to find in the task. It was just a way to kill time, to tire himself out so he might sleep for a few hours without dreaming of his own signature, black and spidery, on a document he hadn't read. The telephone, once a simple household object, became a source of daily torment. He would stare at it, willing it to ring, rehearsing the casual, breezy tone he would adopt when he heard Mark's voice. "Everything all right, son?" he would ask, as if he hadn't spent the last 60-odd days in a state of simmering panic. But he couldn't bring himself to make the call. Shame was a powerful paralytic. Admitting his fear would mean admitting his foolishness, and he wasn't ready to face that. Not yet. The silence was finally broken on a Tuesday afternoon, a day like any other, gray and cold. He heard the familiar rumble of the mail truck and the metallic clank of the mailbox lid. He waited a few minutes, a silly habit he'd developed, as if not appearing too eager could somehow alter the contents of the delivery. He shuffled down the driveway, his slippers damp from the wet pavement. There were the usual bills, a catalog for gardening supplies, and then he saw it. A crisp, cream-colored envelope with a plastic window. The return address was not a person, but a corporate entity, Sterling Financial Group, followed by a P.O. box in Delaware. His heart gave a painful lurch. He carried it back inside, his hand trembling slightly. He placed it on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. It was just a piece of paper, he told himself, echoing his son's manipulative words. He took a deep breath, slid his thumb under the flap, and tore it open. The paper was thick, expensive. The words were cold, mercilessly clear. He didn't need his reading glasses to make out the bolded text at the top. Preliminary notice of foreclosure. The world tilted on its axis. The quiet kitchen hummed with a sudden, violent energy. He sank into a chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and forced himself to read the dense, legalistic prose. The words leaped off the page, each a separate blow. Notice of default. Loan agreement dated December 24th. Failure to meet payment obligations. The lender hereby initiates foreclosure proceedings. His mind flashed back to William Hamilton's study, to the smell of cigar smoke and the suffocating weight of wealth. He could hear Mark's voice, slick with panic and false reassurance. "It's just a formality, Dad. Just to show the bank I have assets to back me up. Just for a few weeks. Alder, a few weeks." It had been 2 months. 2 months of silence. 2 months of lies. The initial shock gave way to a frantic, clawing panic. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Mark would fix it. He launched for the phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed Mark's number, a number he knew as well as his own. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring was a fresh wave of nausea. On the 5th ring, it went to voicemail. "You've reached Mark Hamilton. Please leave a message." The voice was crisp, professional, the voice of a stranger. Robert hung up and dialed again immediately. A desperate, reflexive action. This time, it was different. There was no ringing, just a single, sterile beep and a recorded voice. "The number you have dialed has been disconnected." Disconnected. The word hung in the silent kitchen. An epitaph. He hadn't just been ignored. He had been cut off. Erased. He was a loose end, and his own son had neatly snipped the thread. He looked around the small, comfortable house that had been his sanctuary for 40 years, the place where he and Sarah had raised their son, where every scuff on the floorboard and every faded patch on the wallpaper told a story. He thought of his promise to her, a promise made in the face of death, a vow to protect this small corner of the world that was theirs. The guilt and the denial that had clouded his mind for 2 months evaporated, burned away by the harsh, clarifying light of reality. And in the empty space they left behind, something new and dangerous began to grow. It started as a flicker of fear, a cold dread at the thought of losing everything. But beneath it, a different heat was rising. It was anger, a white-hot, furious anger. not just at himself for his weakness, but at the son who had used his love as collateral and then vanished. He was cornered. The foreclosure noticed a death warrant for his life as he knew it, and the cornered man has nothing left to lose. The 2-hour drive to Greenwich was a blur of righteous fury and blind panic. The foreclosure notice sat on the passenger seat, a crisp, damning piece of evidence. Robert rehearsed his confrontation with Mark, the words a bitter torrent in his mind. He would demand an explanation. He would demand a solution. He would, for once in his life, raise his voice to his son. He didn't, however, rehearse what he would do when the polished gates of the Hamilton estate refused to open. A disembodied voice crackled from a hidden speaker, polite but firm. "May I help you, sir? I'm here to see Mark Hamilton. I'm his father, Robert." A pause. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of his car's engine. He was being vetted, judged. Finally, the voice returned. "Mr. Hamilton is not expecting you. Please wait." Minutes later, the heavy iron gates swung inward with a silent, regal grace. The voice instructed him to proceed to the main house, where he was met not by his son, but by a housekeeper who led him through the cavernous, silent mansion to a different wing. William Hamilton's home office was nothing like the mahogany and leather den of power Robert remembered. This was a cool, minimalist space of glass and steel, with a panoramic window that looked out onto the manicured perfection of a private golf course. It was a room designed to intimidate, to make one feel small and insignificant. William stood behind a large glass desk, not a single paper disturbing its pristine surface. He did not invite Robert to sit. The message was clear. This was not a meeting of equals. "I knew you'd come," William said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was a statement of fact, like commenting on the weather. "Mark isn't here." "Where is he?" Robert demanded, his rehearsed anger feeling flimsy and inadequate in this sterile environment. A small, cruel smile played on William's lips. "He's in what we might call mental rehab, a very exclusive facility in Arizona. A fancy way of saying he's relearning how not to embarrass his family." He gestured vaguely at the empty chair on Robert's side of the desk. "He made a mess. A very public, very foolish mess. I'm cleaning it up." "The house," Robert began, holding up the letter from the bank. "The foreclosure." William cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "That bank is no longer your concern. I had one of my holding companies buy the debt last month. I am your creditor now, Robert." The floor seemed to fall away. Robert gripped the back of the chair to steady himself. This wasn't just a family crisis anymore. He had walked out of a domestic drama and straight into a corporate takeover. He was no longer dealing with his weak, desperate son. He was facing the final boss. "I don't care about your house, Robert," William continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's too small. It's probably in a dreadful neighborhood. I care about control. I care about the Hamilton name, which my daughter foolishly bestowed upon your son." He slid open a drawer and produced a single document, placing it on the glass between them. He pushed it forward with the tip of his finger. "Here is the deal. This is a simple deed transfer. You sign this paper, transferring the property to me, and we will consider Mark's debt your debt repaid. A debt of honor, settled cleanly. In return, the story of my son-in-law's spectacular failure, of his leveraging his own father's home and losing it all on a worthless tech startup, never sees the light of day. Mark will still have a future, albeit one that I will be managing very, very closely." Robert stared at the document, his mind reeling. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from his neck to his face. William hadn't just outmaneuvered him. He was enjoying it. He was treating Robert's life, his home, his memories, as a minor inconvenience, a bit of messy accounting to be tidied up. "And if I don't sign?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. William's eyes turned to ice. "If you don't sign, I will ensure that every financial newspaper from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Post runs a detailed story on how brilliant investor Mark Hamilton defrauded his retired professor father out of his home. I will ruin him. I will make his name synonymous with failure and cowardice. He'll never work in this town, or any other, again. Catherine will divorce him, of course. You can choose, Robert, your quaint little house, or what's left of your son's life. The impossible choice. The same choice as before, but this time the stakes were clearer, the manipulation more blatant, more cruel. William was leveraging the same paternal love that Mark had, but with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon. The fear that had gripped Robert for 2 months was gone. In its place was a cold, quiet fury. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity. He looked at the paper, then back at William's smug, arrogant face. The face of a man who had never faced the consequence in his life. A man who believed everything and everyone had a price. Robert said nothing. He reached out, took the deed transfer from the desk, folded it neatly, and put it in his jacket pocket. He turned without a word and walked out of the office, out of the silent, soulless mansion, and back into the real world. The ultimatum hanging in the air behind him like the lingering scent of expensive cologne. He hadn't agreed, but he hadn't refused. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of power in that silence. The game had changed, and he was no longer just a pawn. The house was silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that presses in on you just before you admit defeat. Robert sat in his small study, the same room where he had graded thousands of history papers, the same room where he and Sarah had once sat late into the night, dreaming up plans for their garden. On the polished surface of his old oak desk lay two objects, William Hamilton's deed transfer and a simple ballpoint pen. This was it. The end of the line. He had spent the afternoon walking through the house, touching the walls, running his hand along the banister Sarah had chosen, staring out at the rose bushes she had so lovingly planted. He had fought a war in his own mind and lost. How could he let his son be destroyed? A man's reputation, his future, was that not worth more than wood and plaster? He picked up the pen, the cheap plastic, a pathetic contrast to the Mont Blanc he had used to sign away his security just 2 months prior. His hand hovered over the signature line, a tremor of resignation running through his arm. He was about to break his promise to Sarah for the second and final time. Then the phone rang. The sound was a violent intrusion, a shriek in the funereal quiet. It was an unknown number, glowing on the small screen. His first instinct was to ignore it. What did it matter? Some telemarketer trying to sell him a cruise he couldn't take from a home he wouldn't have. But some flicker of defiance he didn't know he still possessed, made him answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice hoarse. "Am I speaking with Robert Thorne?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and unfamiliar. "Yes." "Who is this?" "My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney. I was the personal estate planner for your late wife, Sarah Thorne." Robert felt a jolt of confusion. He had handled Sarah's will himself. It had been simple, straightforward. Everything to him, and then to Mark. "I'm sorry. I believe you are mistaken. I managed my wife's affairs." "You manage your joint affairs, Robert." The lawyer corrected gently. "I am the trustee for a separate legal entity, the Sarah Thorne Legacy Trust. Sarah set it up years ago before you were married to manage her personal assets." Robert sank back into his chair. Personal assets? Sarah had been a biomedical engineer, a brilliant one. He'd always known that. He had one of her patents framed on the wall, a complex diagram for a synthetic biocompatible polymer that he never fully understood. He thought of it as a charming memento of her past life. "I don't understand," Robert said. "Sarah was a very shrewd woman, Robert. And a very private one," Mr. Chen explained. "She wanted your life together to be about your life, not her money. She structured the trust to be a fail-safe, a guardian angel, if you will. It was to remain dormant unless a very specific set of distress signals were triggered." A cold dread mixed with a wild, impossible hope began to dawn in Robert's mind. Distress signals? The primary trigger, the lawyer said, his voice steady, is any lien, encumbrance, or legal action taken against your primary residence. When Sterling Financial Group filed the preliminary notice of foreclosure, it was like a silent alarm going off in my system. The trust was automatically activated. The room began to spin. Robert gripped the edge of his desk. He looked from the hateful document William had given him to the framed patent on the wall. He had been looking at a piece of paper. He should have been looking at a queen on a chessboard. What does the trust do?" Robert stammered. He could almost hear the lawyer smile on the other end of the line. "Well, first, it's quite substantial. The royalties from Sarah's patents over the last 2 decades have been significant. But most importantly, for your current situation, is the trust's primary directive. Let me read you Clause 3b. There was a rustle of paper. The trust is authorized as its first and non-negotiable duty to deploy its capital to buy out any and all financial encumbrances on designated family assets that are deemed to be in danger. The lawyer's voice faded into the background. Robert was no longer in his study. He was hearing Sarah's voice, seeing her wry smile, feeling the fierce, protective love that he had thought was lost to him forever. She had seen this coming. Maybe not the specifics, not the Hamiltons or the venture capital, but she had seen the potential for disaster. She had known her son's weaknesses, and she had built a fortress around the life they had shared. A fortress Robert never even knew existed. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't a pawn in William Hamilton's game. He was the beneficiary of a brilliant woman's love and the executor of her hidden power. He was the manager of a fund that could likely buy and sell William Hamilton's control without a second thought. Robert looked down at the deed transfer on his desk. He looked at the cheap pen in his hand. Then he looked out the window at the dark garden his wife had loved so fiercely, the garden she was still protecting from beyond the grave. A slow smile spread across his face. The first genuine smile in months. The power hadn't just shifted. The entire game had changed. And he, Robert Thorne, the quiet history professor, was about to make his move. The despair that had hollowed out Robert's home was gone, replaced by a quiet, electric hum of intellectual energy. His study, for 2 months a prison of anxiety, was now a war room. The crushing weight of William Hamilton's ultimatum had been lifted, and in its place was the exhilarating lightness of purpose. He was a historian, and he had just been presented with the most compelling subject of his career, the anatomy of a tyrant. His first call to David Chen, the lawyer for the Sarah Thorne Legacy Trust, was not what the attorney had expected. "Mr. Chen," Robert said, his voice crisp and clear, "I have no immediate intention of buying back the debt on my house. That can wait. What I need from you is information. I want your firm's research division to pull every public record, every financial statement, every news article, every interview, every SEC filing related to William Hamilton and his corporate entities for the last 30 years. I'm not looking for a silver bullet to win a lawsuit. I'm looking for a pattern." For the next week, Robert was a man possessed. His dining room table disappeared under stacks of paper. He worked with a methodical focus he hadn't felt since his doctoral dissertation. He wasn't a financier, and he didn't try to be. He ignored the complex spreadsheets and market analyses. He had lawyers for that. His focus was on the words, the quotes in old Forbes magazine profiles, the language of hostile takeover announcements, the carefully worded platitudes in annual reports. He was excavating the man behind the money. A green picture emerged. William Hamilton hadn't built an empire. He had conquered one. The files were a litany of ruthlessness. Family-owned manufacturing plants bought out and stripped for assets. Towns decimated by mass layoffs. Competitors crushed with brutal efficiency. The press had nicknamed him the Greenwich Vulture in the 90s, a moniker he spent the last 2 decades trying to bury under a mountain of philanthropic donations. Robert wasn't looking for a crime. He was looking for a motive. What did a man who had everything truly want? The answer didn't come from the Wall Street Journal archives. It came, ironically, from a glossy feature in Vanity Fair about the new titans of philanthropy. There, nestled between photos of glittering galas, was a fawning interview with William. Robert read one sentence, and the entire landscape shifted into focus. "Money is just a tool." William was quoted as saying, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. "A legacy is eternal." Legacy. That was it. The vulture didn't want to be remembered as a vulture. He wanted to be remembered as a Medici, a Carnegie, a benefactor of civilization. His fear wasn't losing money. It was being judged harshly by history. Armed with this new understanding, Robert's research took a sharp turn. He began investigating William's charitable contributions, and soon he found the crown jewel, a massive legacy-defining project. William Hamilton was the sole 9-figure benefactor for the new American Heritage Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was the ultimate reputation laundry service, His name would be carved in marble, his portrait hung in the grand entrance. He would be immortalized not as a corporate raider, but as a great patron of the arts. The project was his obsession, the capstone of his life's work, and the public relations campaign was already in full swing. Robert leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He felt the pure, intellectual delight of a historian who has finally connected the dots and found the hidden, crucial pattern. He had found the chicken coop door. He had found his battlefield. He picked up the phone and dialed David Chen. "David, I know how we're going to use the trust," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I need you to prepare a grant, a very, very large one, the largest in the trust's history. I want to make a naming rights level donation to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, specifically for the new American Heritage Wing." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "You want to co-sponsor the wing with a man who is trying to take your house?" "Not co-sponsor," Robert corrected gently. "I want to make a donation so significant, so publicly generous, that it forces the museum's ethics committee to re-examine the reputation of its other lead benefactor. We're going to give them a choice." He hung up the phone. He walked over to his desk and opened the drawer where he had placed the deed transfer William had given him. He took it out, holding the document that had, only days ago, been his death sentence. He didn't tear it up. He folded it neatly and placed it back in the drawer. It was no longer a threat. It was a souvenir of his enemy's arrogance, a trophy from a battle that William Hamilton didn't even know he was about to lose. The first move in Robert's counteroffensive was not a thunderous cannon shot, but a quiet, meticulously crafted email. He sat with David Chen in his study, the room now a command center, debating the nuance of every word. The final draft was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a silk glove wrapped around a mailed fist. It was addressed directly to William Hamilton. It began by acknowledging William's generous offer to resolve the unfortunate financial misunderstanding. It stated, quite formally, that Robert, acting on behalf of the Sarah Thorne Legacy Trust, would not be signing the deed transfer. Instead, the email proposed an alternative. In the spirit of family reconciliation, Robert had dictated while Chen typed. "The trust wishes to settle this debt of honor personally and in full. We propose to do so at a time and place of your choosing. But might I suggest an occasion that is already symbolic of family unity? Next year's Christmas party at your home would seem a fitting venue for such a gesture of goodwill." The email concluded by noting that Robert would, of course, be accompanied by his legal counsel to ensure the transaction was seamless. William Hamilton received the email on his iPad while lounging by his infinity pool. He read it once, then a second time, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. He called for his wife. "Eleanor, you must read this," he said, handing her the device. "The old professor wants to put on a play." Eleanor scanned the message, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rising slightly. "He's refusing to sign?" "Oh, he'll sign," William scoffed, taking a sip of his iced tea. "This is just theatrics. He wants to save face. He wants to stand up in front of everyone and make a grand show of paying me back, as if he hasn't been cowering in his little cottage for months. He thinks he can control the narrative." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "It's pathetic, but it's also perfect. Fine, we'll give him a stage for his grand surrender." He couldn't imagine any other possibility. His worldview was built on a simple foundation. Power won. He had all the power. Therefore, he would win. The idea that Robert, a man he viewed as little more than a dusty academic footnote, could be maneuvering against him was simply not in the realm of possibility. His arrogance was a suit of armor so thick it had rendered him completely blind. His reply, drafted by his own team of lawyers, arrived the next day. It was a model of condescending magnanimity. He was delighted by Robert's honorable proposal and agreed that the Christmas party would be the ideal setting to put this unfortunate matter behind us once and for all. He looked forward to welcoming Robert into his home to finalize the arrangement. In his study, Robert read the acceptance email. He felt no surge of triumph, no rush of adrenaline. He felt only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a historian watching a predictable pattern unfold. William Hamilton was acting exactly as the historical precedents of arrogant men suggested he would. Robert took a pen and turned to the large desk calendar. He flipped forward, month after month, until he reached the pristine empty grid of the following year. He drew a neat, firm circle around December 24th. The trap was set. Now, all he had to do was wait. The year was not idle. The Sarah Thorne Legacy Trust, once a dormant legal entity, began to stir. There were no splashy announcements, just a series of quiet, strategic donations. A new wing for a children's hospital, a scholarship fund for women in engineering at the state university, a grant to digitize historical archives at a local library. Each act built a small, solid brick in the foundation of a new public reputation. Respectable, benevolent, and deeply rooted in the community. Robert was no longer just a retired professor. He was the chairman of a significant philanthropic force. Sometime in the late spring, Mark was sent home from his mental rehab. Robert received a clipped, formal email from Catherine informing him of the fact. There was no invitation to visit. He heard through a mutual acquaintance that Mark was a ghost in his own life. A thin, silent shadow drifting through the cavernous rooms of the Greenwich mansion. His wife and her family treating him with the polite, distant chill one reserves for a piece of furniture that has become an embarrassment. Time spooled on, the leaves turned, fell, and were covered by the first snows. The invitation to the Hamiltons' annual Christmas Eve party arrived, as it always did, on thick, cream-colored cardstock. It felt heavier this year, charged with the weight of unspoken intentions. Robert looked at the calendar on his desk. The circled date was now just days away. He felt a calm he hadn't known in years. He was not a guest preparing for a party. He was a general on the eve of a battle. His strategy set, his troops in position. His enemy marching confidently toward a field of battle Robert himself had chosen. A year to the day, Robert walked back into the belly of the beast. The return felt like stepping into a memory, meticulously restaged. Greenwich House was once again a perfect, glittering bauble of holiday cheer. A symphony of access designed to overwhelm the senses. The air was a familiar assault. The sharp, clean scent of pine from a ridiculously oversized Christmas tree, the cloying sweetness of expensive perfume, and the underlying metallic tone of immense wealth. But this year, the sensory overload did not disarm him. It clarified his purpose. This year, everything was different, because Robert was different. He wore a navy suit tailored with a precision that was both an armor and a statement. It spoke of quiet confidence, a stark contrast to the slightly too warm, slightly too academic tweed jacket of his memory. He was no longer a bewildered victim seeking an audience. He was a principal in the negotiation, and he had come to state his terms. He was not alone. At his side, moving with an unobtrusive grace, was David Chen. His lawyer was a calm, unassuming man whose soft-spoken demeanor belied a mind of surgical sharpness. The worn leather briefcase he carried seemed innocuous, but Robert knew it contained more devastating firepower than a small army. They were met just inside the foyer, as if William Hamilton had been lying in wait. He descended upon them, radiating a smug, proprietary bonhomie that was almost theatrical. He was a king in his court, about to enjoy a particularly satisfying public execution. He clapped a hand on Robert's shoulder, the grip a fraction too tight, a gesture less of welcome and more of ownership. His voice boomed, pitched just loud enough for the constellation of nearby guests to hear every word. "Robert, so glad to see you could make it. A man of honor, keeping his promise to the letter." The sarcasm was a blunt instrument, intended to humiliate, to cast Robert in the role of the chastened debtor. A year ago, it would have found its mark, stirring a helpless, defensive anger. Tonight, Robert simply smiled. It was a calm, placid smile that held no warmth, only a placid, unnerving certainty. It didn't reach his eyes, and its effect on William was immediate and visible, a momentary flicker of confusion in his host's triumphant gaze. It was the smile of a man who knew the punchline to a joke no one else had heard yet. "Of course, William," Robert said, his voice perfectly even. carrying easily in the brief lull. I wouldn't miss it for the world. He allowed his eyes to drift past his host, his gaze a slow, deliberate sweep of the opulent room. He was not a guest, but a cartographer, mapping the terrain of his own history. He saw Eleanor, William's wife, holding court by the massive stone fireplace, her laughter as brittle and carefully constructed as her diamond necklace. He saw Catherine, her smile as perfect and frozen as a spun sugar ornament on the towering tree. They were part of the scenery, beautiful, expensive, and ultimately irrelevant to the evening's true business. And then he saw Mark. His son was an island of solitude in the sea of forced merriment. He stood alone by one of the tall, floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the snow-blanketed lawn, a pale silhouette against the deep blue of the winter twilight. He was a ghost at his own party. Robert's breath caught. The change in his son was staggering. He was thinner, his skin having a gray, papery quality under the glittering lights. The expensive suit, which a year ago would have been a symbol of his ambition, now hung on his frame like a costume for a role he had forgotten how to play. But it was his eyes that struck Robert to the core. They were haunted, vacant, the eyes of a man perpetually looking over his shoulder. Robert felt a pang, sharp and unexpected. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It was a deep, sorrowful pity for the hollowed-out man his son had become. With a quiet murmur of apology, Robert excused himself, leaving David Chen to weather the storm of William's self-satisfied prattling. He crossed the room, his path a straight, determined line through the clusters of gossiping guests, and stopped beside the window. Mark, the name was spoken softly, yet Mark flinched as if from a blow. He turned from the window with the startled, graceless jerk of a man whose nerves were perpetually frayed. "Dad, you came. I said I would." Robert looked at his son, truly looked at him for the first time in a year. The brash confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, palpable fear. He saw the terror of William in the constant, nervous darting of his eyes. But beneath that, as Mark met his gaze, Robert saw something else flicker into existence, a desperate, pleading hope. He was a prisoner, pacing his cell, who had just caught the glint of a key in the jailer's hand. There was no time for a lengthy reconciliation, for the dredging up of old pains. The intricate gears of Robert's plan were already turning. The countdown had begun. He reached out and put a hand on his son's arm. The gesture was not one of accusation or even forgiveness, but of a quiet, urgent solidarity. "Listen to me, Mark," he said, his voice low, pitched only for his son to hear. "In a few minutes, William is going to make a speech. He's going to try to turn this evening into his personal theater, a spectacle. He thinks he knows exactly how this story is going to end." Robert paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, ensuring he had Mark's complete, undivided attention. "He is wrong. Tonight, when it all begins, you will have a choice to make. You can stand with him, or you can stand with the truth. Choose the right side." Mark stared at him, his brow furrowed in a mixture of fear and confusion. What are you talking about? What choice?" But Robert offered no further explanation. He simply gave his son's arm a final, firm squeeze, a silent transfer of strength, and walked away. He left Mark standing by the window, a seed of bewildered uncertainty now planted in the barren ground of his fear. He was offering a key, but Mark would have to have the courage to turn it in the lock. As if summoned by an invisible director, William Hamilton stepped to the center of the room. He tapped a crystal champagne flute with a small silver spoon, the clear, high-pitched chime slicing through the cheerful din of the party. A hush fell, rippling outwards from William until the grand hall was wrapped in an expectant silence. William beamed, his face a mask of benevolent patriarchy. "Friends, family," he began, his voice resonating with false warmth. "Thank you all for being here. As many of you know, family is the bedrock of my life, the most important thing to me. And sometimes, in families, there are misunderstandings, complications, debts that need to be settled to make things whole again." His gaze swept the room and landed, with theatrical gravity, on Robert, who now stood with David Chen near the base of the grand staircase. He gestured expansively. "My father-in-law, Robert, a man of great learning and profound honor, has come here tonight to publicly resolve such a family matter, a gesture of immense integrity, and one that speaks volumes about his character. The trap was sprung. The public stage was set. The humiliation was primed. Every eye in the room pivoted to Robert. 100 gazes painted with a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled contempt. They saw what William wanted them to see: a tired old man, cornered and beaten, brought to heel and about to be publicly shamed by a titan of industry. William's smile was a predator's, triumphant and cruel. He was savoring his victory. Robert stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, a portrait of unnerving calm. He met William's gaze across a crowded room, his own expression unreadable, a placid lake concealing untold depths. Beside him, David Chen discreetly unlatched his briefcase. The pieces were all in their final positions. The manufactured calm was about to break. The storm was about to hit. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? William Hamilton's smile was a fixed, predatory thing. He had his audience rapt and silent. He had his victim standing before him. All that was missing was the final, public act of submission. He extended a hand, palm up, a gesture of both royal expectation and casual dismissal. "Well, Robert," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the grand room. "My checkbook is ready when you are." "For the debt of honor," the guest murmured, a ripple of polite, morbid curiosity. They leaned in, eager for the denouement of this uncomfortable little family drama. Robert looked at the outstretched hand, then back at William's smug face. He smiled, a slow, gentle, and utterly devastating smile, and he shook his head. "No, William," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying with perfect clarity in the sudden silence. "There will be no check." A flicker of confusion crossed William's face. This was not in the script. He started to speak, but before he could, David Chen stepped forward, holding a sleek leather folio. "Mr. Hamilton Chen," began, his voice the calm, professional epicenter of the burgeoning storm. "My client, Mr. Thorne, will not be repaying you. Instead, acting as chairman of the Sarah Thorne Legacy Trust, he has instructed me to make an announcement." Chen opened the folio. "The Sarah Thorne Legacy Trust is, tonight, making a formal pledge of $25 million to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, specifically for the completion of the new American Heritage Wing." A collective gasp went through the room. $25 million. It was an astonishing sum, a figure that commanded immediate respect and attention. William's face, which had been a mask of arrogant certainty, now registered a profound shock. He had been financially outmaneuvered, publicly, in his own home. He was no longer the sole benefactor. His legacy was now shared. But Chen wasn't finished. He let the number hang in the air for a moment before delivering the killing blow. "This donation," he continued, looking directly at William, "comes with two conditions. First, that the new wing be named not only for its primary benefactor, but jointly as the Hamilton Thorne Wing. And second," Chen paused, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the guests, "that the museum's board of directors conduct a comprehensive ethics audit of its major funding sources to ensure that the legacy of Sarah Thorne is aligned with partners who share her unimpeachable standards of integrity." It was a declaration of war, disguised as a charitable gift, a direct public challenge to William's reputation. Rejecting the money would make him look petty and vindictive. Accepting it would mean submitting his entire business history, his hostile takeovers, his mass layoffs, his Greenwich Vulture pass to the scrutinous gaze of the museum's notoriously stuffy ethics committee. He was trapped. His face, just moments ago flushed with victory, was now a mottled, ashen gray. And then a new sound cut through the suffocating silence. Bzz, bzz. It was a phone vibrating violently against the glass surface of a nearby side table. Every head turned. Mark was standing beside the table, staring at the screen of his phone as if it were a venomous snake. He fumbled to silence it, his hands shaking, but as soon as he did, it started again. Buzz, buzz, buzz. What the hell is that, Mark? Turn it off! William hissed, his composure finally cracking, his voice a furious whisper. The public humiliation was metastasizing, spreading from him to his son-in-law. Mark jabbed at the screen, his face slick with sweat. But the calls kept coming, one after another, a relentless electronic assault. The name on the screen was different each time. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, E-Times Trade, a dozen other brokers and banks. Robert watched the chaos unfold with the calm detachment of a man watching a perfectly executed experiment. He turned to William, his expression one of mild academic curiosity. It sounds like margin calls, he said, his voice conversational, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. Our fund had to divest from a few small, over-leveraged biotech companies this afternoon to free up the capital for our donation. A purely procedural move, but I did hear that some investors were dangerously exposed in that particular space. It can be a volatile market if you don't know what you're doing. The pieces clicked into place in William's mind. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a coordinated attack. Robert hadn't just ambushed his reputation. He had simultaneously carpet-bombed his son-in-law's financial existence. The calls, Robert would later learn, were 47 separate, automated notifications from a system in total collapse. 47 electronic messengers delivering the same news. You are ruined. All of William's fury, his humiliation, his loss of control, now had a target. He rounded on Mark, who was still frantically trying to silence the infernal buzzing. Is that how you manage money? William snarled the question, a final brutal verdict. Is this the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity you begged me for? That was the final blow. The public judgment from the man he had sacrificed everything to please. Mark let out a sound, a choked, guttural sob of utter despair. His legs gave way, and he didn't just fall. He collapsed, slumping to the floor in a boneless heap amidst the glittering perfection of the party. His phone still buzzing, a death rattle for his entire life. A horrified silence descended upon the room. The party was over. The guests stood frozen, staring at the man crumpled on the floor, at the pale, furious face of William Hamilton, and at the quiet, dignified history professor who had, in the space of 5 minutes, burned an empire to the ground without ever raising his voice. The victory was total, silent, and absolute. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? The return was quieter than any departure. A few weeks after the muted festivities of a solitary Christmas, Robert turned his key in the lock of his own front door. The sound, once a simple mechanical act, now echoed with the finality of a gavel strike. The house was his again, not just in spirit, but in the cold, hard language of deeds and trusts. The foundation, his foundation, was its legal guardian now, a fortress secured against all future threats. The war was over. The victory was absolute, and in the chilling January air that greeted him in the grand foyer, Robert felt the profound, soul-deep exhaustion of a soldier who wins the field, only to find himself the last one standing. He had expected a surge of something pride, relief, perhaps even a grim satisfaction. Instead, a wave of profound emptiness washed over him. He stood for a long moment, his hands still on the doorknob, listening. The house had its own unique silence, a quality he had once cherished. It was the silence of thick walls, old wood, and generations of quiet living. But this was a new kind of quiet. It was the sound of absence. The tense, charged silence of his final months with Mark had been replaced by a vacuum, a stillness that didn't soothe but amplified his solitude. He walked from room to room, his footsteps a lonely percussion on the polished oak floors. It was a pilgrimage through a museum of his own life. Everything was pristine, exactly as it should be. The living room, with its deep leather armchairs and fireplace swept clean, waited for conversations that would never happen. The grand dining room, its long table gleaming under a crystal chandelier, was a testament to family gatherings that now felt like scenes from another man's history. He ran a hand along the back of a chair, the wood cool and unresponsive beneath his touch. He had saved the physical structure, the bricks and mortar, the collection of objects that constituted a home, but the spirit, the intangible warmth that turns a house into a haven, had fled. He had won the battle for the soul of his legacy, but in doing so, he realized he had lost his son in a way that felt more final than any argument or estrangement. On the mahogany console table in the hall, a small stack of mail lay waiting. Bills, circulars, a notice from the local council. Beneath them, a single, cream-colored envelope stood out. He didn't need to see a return address. He recognized the handwriting instantly, Mark's loose, impatient scrawl, the letters leaning forward as if eager to be done with the task. A jolt, not of anger, but of a deep, weary sorrow, went through him. For a moment, he was tempted to throw it away, to toss it unopened into the cold fireplace, and let it become ash. Just another piece of their scorched history. It could hold nothing good. It would be a plea, a justification, a barb veiled in contrition. Another move in the game he no longer had the energy to play, but he didn't. With a sigh that seemed to draw up all the fatigue from his bones, he picked it up. The paper felt thin, insubstantial in his hand. He carried it into his study, the room that had become his war room, the strategic center of his quiet, meticulous campaign. The files and ledgers were gone now, replaced by the familiar clutter of books and papers from his life before the fight. He sat down heavily in his desk chair, the leather groaning in protest, and stared at his own name written in his son's hand. After a long minute, he reached for the silver letter opener, a gift from his late wife, and slit the seal with a precise, steady movement. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was startlingly brief. His eyes scanned the page, bracing for the familiar sting of manipulation or the hollow clang of a forced apology. But the words he found were not the ones he had prepared himself for. Mark did not mention the foundation, the lawsuit, or William's quiet, humiliating capitulation. He did not speak of money, of assets, of the inheritance he had so desperately tried to accelerate. There was no desperate plea for forgiveness, no attempt to rationalize his actions. It was devoid of the language of their conflict. Instead, Mark wrote of a memory, a small, seemingly insignificant moment from a childhood that now felt like a distant country. He wrote about a clear, cold autumn night, years ago, when he couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. He described being woken by Robert, bundled into a coat over his pajamas, and led into the damp, cold air of the back garden. He remembered the specific, earthy smell of the wet grass and the prickle of the chilled air on his face. He recalled the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, a comforting pressure against the immense, dark void above. And he remembered Robert's voice, low and calm, pointing out the constellations. He described the faint, shimmering belt of Orion the Hunter, the steady, reliable glow of Polaris, the North Star, and the sprawling, mythical tale of Cassiopeia. He remembered not the astronomical facts, but the sense of boundless wonder, the feeling of being infinitesimally small, yet securely anchored to the world by his father's presence. The letter concluded with 2 simple, devastating sentences. I spent years learning how to navigate the markets, how to read the numbers and predict the trends, but I've forgotten how to look up, Dad. I just looked down at the numbers. Robert read the letter once, then twice. He lowered the page to his desk, his gaze unfocused, seeing not the grain of the wood, but the ghost of a small boy wrapped in a blanket. His face turned to the heavens in awe. The words were not an excuse. They were a diagnosis, a stark, unvarnished admission of a profound inner failure. For the first time, perhaps in his entire adult life, Mark had demonstrated a flicker of genuine self-awareness. It wasn't a promise of change, nor was it a request for absolution. It was simply a confession of being lost, a quiet acknowledgement sent out into the void, with no expectation of a reply. A profound wave of sadness, deeper and purer than any anger he had felt, washed through him. There were no tears, The time for such passionate displays felt long past. This was a quieter, more desolate grief. It was a grief of acceptance. He folded the letter precisely along its original creases, the movements of his hands slow and deliberate. He did not consider writing back. What could he say? That he understood? That he forgave him? Words were the currency of their conflict, weapons they had both wielded with damaging precision. Silence, now, felt more honest, more respectful of the fragile, broken thing that lay between them. A response would feel like a negotiation, an opening of a door he wasn't ready to walk through. The letter wasn't a beginning. It was an epitaph for what had been. He opened the top drawer of his desk, the one where he kept his most private papers. His fingers brushed against the crisp edge of another document, the official transfer slip from William's accounts, the silent, digital admission of defeat. He took Mark's letter and placed it carefully beside the slip. The two documents lay together in the darkness of the drawer. One, a record of a financial victory. The other, a testament to a catastrophic emotional loss. He closed the drawer, the quiet click of the wood sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. It was done. The file was closed. As dusk began to bleed its soft violet hues across the winter sky, Robert found himself drawn to the garden. He stepped out onto the stone patio, the cold air a sharp, clean shock against his skin. The first stars were beginning to emerge, faint pinpricks of light in the deepening twilight. He walked across the dormant lawn, the frozen grass crunching softly under his shoes, until he reached the spot where he and the small boy had stood all those years ago. He tilted his head back and looked up. The sky was immense, indifferent, a canvas of impossible depth and ancient light. He wasn't looking for the familiar shapes of the constellations. He wasn't trying to recapture the past or search for meaning in the celestial patterns. He was simply standing there, breathing in the cold, still air. He stood in the silence of his empty house, a victor surrounded by the spoils of a war he now understood had no true winners. His peace was not the peace of happiness, but the quiet, somber peace of acceptance. The story was over, but as he stood under the vast, silent watch of the stars, he was left with the weight of his questions, questions that would echo in the quiet rooms of his house for a long time to come. Is a victory worth such a cost? What does forgiveness look like when reconciliation is impossible? And does a man who has forgotten how to look up ever truly deserve a second chance to see the stars? The night offered no answers, only its profound, silent, and endless depth.